There are moments in history that do not simply unfold, they rupture, leaving behind a world fundamentally altered from what existed the day before. The recent Iranian strike on Israel was one such moment. In a single, calculated act, decades of geopolitical balance, military deterrence, and psychological dominance were shaken to the core. What was once unthinkable, the image of Israel in ruins, its infrastructure crumbling, its people bewildered, suddenly became reality. And not just any reality, but one that bore haunting similarities to the very suffering Israel had long been perceived to rise above. For 77 years, Israel had projected strength. Its iron defenses, its advanced military technology, its strategic alliances, all were part of a narrative of survival and resilience. But narratives are fragile things. They live in the mind more than on the battlefield. And when a single act pierces that narrative, exposing raw vulnerability, the consequences are not just tactical, they are existential. This is not merely a story about missiles and destruction. It is a story about perception, about identity, about what happens when the protector becomes the endangered and when roles are reversed in the theater of history. It's about how a region already exhausted by conflict now teeters on the edge of a new kind of chaos, one where the traditional lines between aggressor and victim blur. We are witnessing a redefinition of power, not as an absolute force, but as a fragile illusion sustained by belief. And when belief collapses, everything else collapses with it. Policy, pride, and the promise of peace. The Israeli landscape, once a symbol of defense and defiance, now mirrors the very images that for years evoked international sympathy for Gaza. Craters where homes stood, smoke in the skies, the echo of sirens, replacing the calm of morning prayers. Yet beyond the political and military dimensions lies the human story. A story of civilians caught in the deadly crossfire of strategies and retaliations, of mothers shielding children and fathers digging through rubble, all while the architects of these calamities argue in conference rooms and media studios. So as we reflect on what this strike has done, not just to a nation, but to the consciousness of a watching world, we must ask ourselves, what does it mean when the image of strength begins to look like the image of suffering? And more importantly, what kind of future can be built when history starts to repeat itself, not as a lesson, but as a warning ignored? This is the moment we examine not only what happened, but what it means for all of us. For decades, Israel was seen as the fortress that could not fall, a bastion of technological prowess and unchallenged military superiority in the Middle East. Its air defenses intercepted rockets with uncanny precision. Its intelligence networks penetrated the darkest corners of enemy plots. Its alliances, especially with the United States, reinforced the belief that it stood beyond reach. This wasn't just a narrative crafted for geopolitical advantage. It was at a deeper level, a psychological reality. People internalized it, believing that the image of Israel's impunity was as unassailable as its concrete walls and iron dome. Then came the Iranian strike, surgical in execution and devastating in its implications. It didn't merely damage infrastructure or cost lives, though it did both. What it did above all was puncture a myth. In an instant, the walls of perceived invincibility cracked. And when a myth at the core of identity fractures, the psychological blow is far more destructive than any missile. Think about how belief shapes behavior. When you believe something is impossible, you don't prepare for it. You don't guard against it. You don't even entertain the thought. That's the power of invincibility. It frees up resources for projection rather than defense, for offense rather than vigilance. Israel's story was one of bold initiatives, of shaping the fight to distant battlefields, of shaping the future rather than merely defending the present. It was a posture born of confidence, and perhaps, in hindsight, of complacency. But human beings and nations are not built to sustain unchallenged dominance forever. History is replete with empires that believed themselves eternal, only to be humbled when the unexpected happened. What Iran's strike did was reintroduce uncertainty at the highest level. It said, "You thought you were untouchable. You were wrong." And that message resonated far beyond strategic circles. It penetrated public consciousness in Tel Aviv, Haifa, and Jerusalem. It whispered doubt into the mind of every citizen who had grown comfortable behind the shield. The psychology of invincibility is a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it breeds courage. It empowers the bold move. On the other, it fosters arrogance and blind spots. It narrows the aperture of perception until only familiar threats matter and unfamiliar ones simply don't register. Iran exploited this. It targeted precisely where the narrative was thickest, where the world least expected penetration. And in doing so, it rewrote the rules of engagement overnight. This collapse of illusion didn't just affect Israeli strategy, it affected the strategy of every nation observing. Allies began to reassess their own defenses. Adversaries dared to imagine new possibilities. Fence-sitters reconsidered their alignments. When the strongest pillar is cracked, the entire structure shudders. In that moment, power is renegotiated, not through treaties, but through the raw, visceral realization that anything can happen. Philosophically, this moment reveals a deeper truth about human existence. No one escapes vulnerability. Invincibility is a fragile construct, sustained only by collective agreement and unchallenged repetition. When the group narrative shifts, even slightly, the entire edifice can crumble. Psychologically, we see the same dynamic in individuals who fall prey to overconfidence. They underestimate risks, they discount anomalies, they ignore the small telltale signs that precede a major crisis, until catastrophe forces them to confront their hubris. For Israel, the question now is whether this realization leads to paralysis or adaptation. Does the nation retreat behind ever thicker defenses, or does it embrace a more nuanced understanding of risk and protection? In either case, the first step is acknowledging that the old story no longer applies. The narrative of unassailable strength must be replaced with one of vigilant resilience. A recognition that strength alone is not enough. That wisdom lies in anticipating the unforeseen. For the rest of the world, there is a lesson as well. We are all prisoners of our own narratives of invulnerability, whether in technology, economics, or even personal relationships. We convince ourselves that certain problems belong to someone else, that certain crises will never touch us. But reality has a way of overturning those assumptions in an instant. The true measure of strength, then, is not how high your walls are, but how quickly you can rebuild when those walls are breached. So the moment we witnessed was not merely a military escalation, it was a profound psychological shift. It taught us that invincibility is an illusion, that vulnerability is universal, and that no fortress is impregnable to ideas, to courage, or to the unexpected. And if we take this lesson to heart, we might emerge not just shaken, but wiser, prepared for a world in which the impossible can and does happen. Remember this, when your authority seems absolute, your greatest strength can become your blind spot. True resilience is born not from unbroken walls, but from the willingness to adapt when those walls come down. When a single strike shifts global consciousness, the question is no longer what happened, but what does it mean? The Iranian strike on Israel was not just an act of military defiance, it was a message encoded in velocity and firepower, directed at a much deeper layer of human psychology, our collective assumptions about power, consequence, and deterrent. It disrupted the narrative we'd been rehearsing for decades, one in which escalation was always theoretical, always restrained by diplomacy, fear, or strategic calculus. Suddenly, one actor decided not to play by the rules, and the rest of the world was forced to stop and reconsider what game we're really in. To understand the weight of this moment, you have to consider how deterrence works. It's a psychological arrangement. The premise is simple. I don't hit you because I believe you'll hit me back harder. It's fear that keeps the peace, not goodwill. But fear only works when belief is intact, and belief is fragile. When someone is willing to absorb the consequences and strike anyway, the entire logic of deterrence begins to fray. That's what Iran did. It looked at the scales and said, we are willing to pay the price. That decision exposed something the rest of the world had conveniently ignored. The deeper motivations that transcend mere survival. Motives like honor, identity, humiliation, revenge, and justice. These are not abstractions in geopolitics, they are psychological forces, and they drive people to do the unthinkable. What we saw was a nation acting not only out of calculation, but out of a deeply rooted narrative about its place in the world. And when that kind of narrative meets the kind of technology we now possess, missiles, drones, cyber warfare, the outcome is not just physical destruction. It is an emotional and cognitive earthquake, Nations that once felt secure now feel exposed. Strategies that seem rational now appear brittle. The world, in a very real sense, just became more dangerous because one of its core psychological contracts, mutual restraint, was violated in full view. This erosion of deterrence doesn't just affect governments or generals, it filters down into the population. People begin to feel that the world is unpredictable again, that their leaders might not be in control. And that is a dangerous emotional atmosphere. Anxiety rises. Polarization intensifies. The thirst for strong answers, however simplistic or dangerous, grows. In moments like this, demagogues thrive. History has shown us that uncertainty is the breeding ground of extremism. When people lose faith in the system's ability to keep them safe, they look for someone who promises absolute safety. And that, ironically, leads to even greater volatility. But let's go even deeper than politics or psychology. Let's talk about the soul of a civilization. A civilization is not held together by military superiority or GDP alone. It's held together by a shared mythos, a sense of order, meaning, and direction. The Iranian strike wasn't just a breach in military defense, it was a symbolic blow to that mythos. It declared that sacred boundaries can be crossed, that no place is truly off limits. That's why it felt so visceral even to those thousands of miles away, because it challenged the fundamental assumption that some red lines are too dangerous to cross. And once one is crossed, others begin to blur. The philosophical implication here is staggering. If deterrence fails, what replaces it? Can we build a new model of global order rooted not in fear, but in mutual respect or shared vulnerability? Or are we reverting to a world where every actor must fend for themselves, trust no one, and strike first out of suspicion? The answer will determine the emotional climate of the next decade. It will shape how we educate our children, how we structure our alliances, and how we define justice in an age of chaos. This is where leadership matters. Because when deterrence collapses, what you need is not more force, but more vision. Not just better weapons, but better wisdom. Someone has to be brave enough to say, yes, the rules are changing, but we can still choose how we respond. The default response is fear. But fear is rarely the best teacher. What we need is clarity. Clarity about what truly matters. Clarity about what kind of world we're trying to build. And clarity about the fact that no missile, no matter how precise, can substitute for the hard work of moral courage. So here's the truth. Deterrence didn't fail because of weakness. It failed because someone chose meaning over safety. And now we all must decide what meaning we are willing to live for and what risks we are willing to take to protect it. If we don't face that question with honesty and humility, the next strike may not just shock the world, it may change it beyond recognition. In moments of shattered certainty, don't ask only how to defend yourself, ask what you stand for. Because when deterrence fades, conviction is all that remains. Let's take a step back from the headlines and consider what's actually happening beneath the surface. The Iranian strike didn't just damage a location, it disrupted a worldview. And the third point we must explore is how this event has unraveled the illusion of control that powerful nations, particularly in the West, have spent decades cultivating. Because for a long time, the assumption has been that through military superiority, diplomatic influence, and technological dominance, chaos could be kept at bay. That assumption, however, is showing cracks. At the heart of this illusion lies a very old, very human desire to master the unknown, to engineer stability, to prevent disruption through careful design and overwhelming force. But that approach only works when all participants agree to the structure. When a nation like Iran acts outside of it, not irrationally, but according to a different internal logic, it reveals a fundamental truth. Control is never absolute. The system only appears stable when everyone is playing along. The moment someone refuses, the scaffolding begins to tremble. What Iran exposed is that the control exercised by dominant powers has limits, psychological, cultural, and strategic. You can intimidate someone only as long as they value what you threaten to take away. But when a nation, or even a person, decides that their identity, their dignity, or their belief system is more valuable than safety or material comfort, traditional leverage loses its power. And that's what's so unsettling to the global order. We are not facing an uncalculated actor. We are facing one with a different set of values, different priorities, and a different definition of victory. This becomes a crisis, not just of politics, but of perception. Because if the West cannot rely on deterrence or diplomacy to maintain influence, what does it rely on? We're seeing a psychological shift where leaders and citizens alike are forced to acknowledge that the global balance is more fragile than they imagined. This is not just about Iran and Israel or Iran and the US. This is about the end of the post-Cold War illusion that power alone can shape outcomes in a morally complex world. And let's not forget the psychological cost of that shattered illusion extends beyond borders. When people begin to feel that even the most powerful governments can't guarantee safety, when they see that diplomacy can fail and deterrence can be ignored, they internalize that uncertainty. It manifests in anxiety, in distrust, in the erosion of faith in institutions. Because if a superpower can be caught off guard, then what about the ordinary citizen? If nations are vulnerable, what does that say about the individual? What emerges from this moment is a profound philosophical question. What is control, and how much of it do we really have? The truth is, real control is never external. It's not about dominating the world. It's about mastering your own response to it. That's the only form of power that can't be taken from you. And yet, we've built entire geopolitical strategies around the illusion that we can force external outcomes while neglecting the internal foundations of discipline, restraint, and moral clarity. It's not about being passive in the face of aggression. It's about responding with vision rather than panic. When you believe that your control extends indefinitely outward, every disruption feels like a failure. But when you accept that chaos is part of the world, your focus shifts inward to the cultivation of wisdom, strength, and meaning. That's where leadership begins. And that's what this moment demands, not just from nations, but from every individual watching this unfold. So now, the challenge becomes existential. Can global leaders and citizens redefine control not as domination, but as moral sovereignty? Can they reject the fantasy that we can predict and manage every outcome, and instead build the resilience to navigate what cannot be controlled? That's the kind of question that leads to growth, but only if we're willing to confront it without illusion. In the end, the illusion of control dies when the truth of human will rises. It's not power that keeps the world in order. It's the wisdom to know when to act, and the humility to know when not to. Let's turn now to something that most people sense but struggle to articulate: the long-term consequences of symbolic events. Because this isn't just about explosions or rubble or retaliatory strikes. It's about what these events mean in the minds of people. When Iran struck and the world watched in silence or confusion, something deeper than military equilibrium was shaken. What changed was perception. Perception of strength, of order, and of moral authority. And that is a transformation that outlives the blast itself. History doesn't remember every detail of conflict. It remembers what events came to represent. Hiroshima wasn't just a bomb, it was a message. The fall of the Berlin Wall wasn't just about concrete. It was about the collapse of an ideology. Likewise, Iran's strike, deliberate, unapologetic, and unflinching, has already begun to take shape as a symbol of defiance in the face of presumed global dominance. And when something becomes a symbol, it starts to replicate. It becomes a model for others, consciously or unconsciously. Now consider what this does to the psychology of other nations, especially those who have lived under the shadow of Western influence for decades. When a weaker actor dares to defy the traditional hegemon and survives, even gains moral high ground in some circles, a paradigm begins to shift. Other nations begin to reimagine what is possible. The old fear starts to crack, and fear, let's be clear, is the glue that has held the current world order together. This is where the danger multiplies, not necessarily in missiles and bombs, but in imitation, in the spread of the idea that you can stand against overwhelming power if your belief is unshakable, that you don't need 1,000 tanks to make a statement that can change the game, that dignity, when protected with conviction, becomes a weapon more destabilizing than any drone. This is also where we must pause and reflect. Because while it's easy to applaud courage, we must also acknowledge the responsibility it carries. Defiance for the sake of ego is not the same as defiance for the sake of principle. One is reactionary, the other is revolutionary. But the West has often been blind to both, treating all opposition as aggression, never asking what fuels it. Why does the weaker nation choose war over silence? Why does it sacrifice comfort for confrontation? These are not rhetorical questions, they are moral imperatives. Because if we dismiss every act of resistance as madness, we never learn from it. And if we never learn, we are doomed to escalate again and again until something breaks in a way that can't be fixed. At the same time, we must ask ourselves what this strike revealed about the spiritual and psychological hunger of the modern world. Because when so many across different cultures cheer, not for war, but for resistance, they're revealing something deeper. A yearning for moral courage, for authenticity, for leadership that isn't rooted in manipulation or self-preservation, but in principle. The Western narrative has long leaned on the idea that might makes right, but it forgets that the human soul is drawn not to dominance, but to meaning. And if dominance is divorced from meaning, if it cannot be justified by anything higher than interest or profit, then sooner or later people will look elsewhere. And when they do, they often look toward the very symbols that those in power tried hardest to suppress. This is why symbolic victories are dangerous to those who rely on narratives of control. They can't be destroyed by counterstrikes. They aren't erased by military victories. Once an idea is in the bloodstream of culture, once it whispers that another way is possible, the old way begins to rot from within. And no empire survives that kind of decay, not because it was beaten from the outside, but because it collapsed from the inside. So we have to ask, very seriously, what kind of world are we building if we continue to ignore the power of symbolism? If we continue to wage wars on symptoms without addressing causes? And more importantly, if we continue to assume that fear will forever keep people obedient? Because that era is ending. Not with declarations or treaties, but with quiet revolutions of thought. And it only takes one defiant act, one refusal to bend, for 100 others to stand up in its wake. The strike was more than a military action, it was a mirror. And what we see in that reflection will define the next chapter of global history, so we must choose wisely. Because symbols don't die, they evolve.